Hey everyone, today we've got Sebastien Couture joining us from Paris, France. Sebastian, how are you doing today?
I'm good, man. It's the end of the day here, and it's nice to do this. It's kind of a light end of my day to be like being on a podcast.
Yeah, thanks for joining. We had a conversation, last week, and it was just one of those, like many of these conversations I have when somebody strikes me as really impressive, really smart. It's like, hey, we should be recording this. There's some gold here. So I'm glad to finally get together to do that.
Yeah, that was a really podcast worthy conversation, and you know, oftentimes I'll have those, and I'll think, how did people do this 50 years ago when there were no podcasts and they were having great conversations that they couldn't record?
Great point. I would think they just get lost or, they try to hire some translator to scribble stuff down. But of course, so much gets lost there. It's kind of
Yeah,
fortuitous. We're at a time where we can just click record.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been in the crypto space for a while. You've got a fund as well. I want to talk
Yeah.
about all this. Talk to us about your journey as a contrarian investor and how that started to parlay and kind of meld into crypto.
I mean, I think that to be in crypto I mean, it is kind of mainstream now. I mean, to some extent, right? Amongst a certain class of people, it is, I guess, mainstream. But I think being in crypto is kind of a fundamentally contrarian um, place. My journey started, like, I spent most of my career educating people about tech. So I started my career, like in my early 20s, working in tech and working in sales and like educating, potential customers about technology, and and then later in my career worked in web technologies, and obviously there, being in web technologies in the 2000s, there's a whole lot of education and pedagogy. I don't know if you can say that in English. That's involved, and so that sort of like has followed me throughout my whole career, is like educating people about crypto or about tech, and then when I came into crypto, this was in 2013. I was working as a project manager at the time in a design agency, and really thought like this is really interesting from the point of view that um, it it really is sort of like a contrarian, um, like a fundamentally contrarian idea that like money can be open, money can be permissionless, that money should exist on the internet, and I felt that that was like a really sort of um, fascinating new development. And originally, I think like a lot of people who get into crypto, my ambition was to try to make money, right, with this new technology, and I actually tried to buy some miners. I'd done all the calculations. I was like pretty sure that if I were like to buy this miner, invest in this miner, I would end up making this much money. But it turned out that I had been off by one decimal point in my calculations, and so I ended up not buying those miners and ended up starting a podcast instead. And so I've been doing that for the last, yeah, it's been over 10 years now since we've been running Epicenter, with my co-host Brian Crane, and we're co-founder, and then some other co-hosts like Sunny Agarwal, Meher Roy, and Frederike Ernst, who joined later on. And in the last 2 years, yeah, I've been working on starting a fund, and we successfully launched that fund in late 2023.
So what was your motivation for starting this podcast, and ultimately how did that, lead to you launching a fund?
Yeah, I mean, starting the podcast was really just like, how can I get involved in this community and also learn about it at the same time? I mean, when the podcast started in 2013, I knew very little about Bitcoin. I had just started reading about it maybe 2 or 3 months before. I had went on this tangent, trying to figure out whether or not I should be buying some mining equipment, and I was listening to a podcast called Let's Talk Bitcoin at the time, which OGs will remember as the OG Bitcoin podcast with Adam B. Levine, and Andreas Antonopoulos was also a host there. and and they were launching a podcast network. And so this podcast network was going to be like the Let's Talk Bitcoin network, and they put out a call for people who wanted to be on this network. So there was a Skype call with myself and a couple of other guys that were interested in launching podcasts on this new LTB network. And that's where I met Brian Crane. We were both living in Europe. Everybody else was in the US. So we thought like, okay, maybe this, let's do this together. So we ended up doing a pilot episode together. So it was really just kind of a like, hey, this could be a cool idea. Like, let's do a podcast with no real kind of long-term vision for it. And it's really, it's really 2 or 3 months later when I attended my first Bitcoin conference and saw that there were, startups building in the space, investors and VCs looking to invest in these projects, really smart people working on this tech, that I thought, okay, there's like potentially like a new career path there. And so I quickly, left the sort of like digital marketing side of my career to focus more on crypto. In 10 years, there's, I've done a couple of other things. I co-founded a company called Stratum, which no longer exists, but at the time was building solutions for the insurance industry to notarize and digitize processes. And we were using blockchains for that. We raised money from some of the largest insurance companies in France, as well as the NASDAQ. And I was also involved in some policy work here in France. But that all sort of, came to a head around 2021 when, I had left Epicenter, my sort of management role at Epicenter, and wanted to do something really different. And, I think like in life, at least for me and for a lot of people I've been around, is, you sort of have like different sprints, right? So you like different career sprints. And I felt that like it was time for me to enter another career sprint. And, I wanted to stay in crypto, but I didn't want to continue to do just like a media business. And so shifting to VC felt like a really natural sort of next sprint. Because I had all this network, I had all this knowledge from having been in crypto now for 10 years, really great industry connections. And I think, a real ambition and sort of like a real desire to connect people and to be around like really smart people that are doing great things. And so, transitioning into full-time investing felt like the next natural thing. And so that's what I've been doing for the last year or so.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, it sounds like there's this continued drive to educate people and to help people understand a new space, even as you're seeking to understand it, which we all are, right? Because crypto is ever changing, it's dynamic, technology is ever changing, it's dynamic, and it's a full-time job, and that either excites you and exhilarates you or it drains you. And I think for people like us, it's exciting. You constantly get to be learning something new. You get to be taking a previous learning that you had, whether it would be within a company or a project you were looking at or a company you invested in. And then, you look for, what was the lesson here and how do I apply that to the next one?
Yeah, that definitely speaks to me. There's been a lot of lessons, and, there's always lessons, right? I mean, like you have lessons throughout life. I think I think it wasn't until like my sort of like mid-20s that I realized that like lessons are actually useful, and they're useful in making sure that you don't make mistakes twice. And so, I think what's been one thing that I've started doing, that I've been doing for the last couple of years, is like when there are these sort of like really important lessons, is to write them down and sort of reflect on them, and just like to make sure that they don't happen again. And that's been something that has been really helpful.
Do you have a big one you can share?
Oh yeah, there's so many. I think one that really stands out is in my last company. So so Stratum, I think we were we were a technology looking for a problem, like a lot of technology startups, and I think in crypto that is definitely the case for a lot of projects. And there was another thing too, which was we didn't really have any focus. We were trying to be too many things at once. We were trying to be a technology solution for the insurance industry, but at the same time, for the banking industry and perhaps some other use cases, and probably we wanted to do smart contracts, and maybe we want to do something else. And I think that ultimately is the reason why like this company didn't succeed. And I've seen I've seen folks sort of leave the company and go on to do other things, and with really this laser focus. And I thought that was like one of the really key lessons there, and one that I try to share with founders pretty regularly. Right, when I look at a team that we're considering for investment, or just like folks we talk to on a regular basis, I think referring them back to this idea that to build something great, you have to have focus, and you have to have sort of like one thing. And there, I believe there's a book called The One Thing also, that I read over the years. But that was one of the main lessons I think that has really stuck with me over the last couple of years.
I love that because, what I miss about early stage VC is the mentorship and the camaraderie that comes along with it, right? And the ideal investor entrepreneur relationship. And, people always think of, the VC and the entrepreneur is kind of against each other. And maybe there's a little bit of that in the negotiation process, but really it should be, hey, I'm coming on to help you. And to be able to pull someone aside, or to have a candid, constructive conversation at the board level that, like you said, seeks to focus on what problem are we trying to solve here versus what technology are we building, I think is what the space needs the most. And it's refreshing to hear.
Yeah, no, that's really one of the things that I love about like what we do, is this ability to like make an impact on entrepreneurs early in their journey. And frankly, like we also learn from entrepreneurs and the folks that we talk to, whether it's other VCs or seasoned entrepreneurs. Like there are people that we get an opportunity to chat with that have like tons of experience and that have done like really great things, and we learn from them as well. And so that's like one of the beauties of being in this space. I think like another lesson too that's coming to mind here is just like being humble about sort of like your experience and what other people can bring you as well. It's not because you're sort of in this VC position that you can't also learn from other VCs or other entrepreneurs in the space. And so I think like being humble there and being open to learning things from other people as well is something that didn't come naturally earlier in my life, but I've learned to just accept and really make the best of.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, the more that I reflect as I get older on what being humble really means, I think being humble comes naturally when you realize, and obviously life kind of beats you up along the way. So you learn this, that there is no just upward trajectory, right? So that like if things are good now, they won't be as good in the future at some point. And then, when things are bad, that they'll get better. And that's kind of like you're on this roller coaster that's life. And, when you're earlier in life, maybe you're just on one small section of the roller coaster. And we could compare that, I think, really nicely with crypto investing, right? Like it's a very volatile asset class. And of course, the advice always is zoom out. And so that gives you a perspective that you didn't have before. And to then be in it and along the ride, it really helps you understand, okay, like maybe I'm feeling on top of the world today, but don't get a big head about it because that's going to be temporary. And then of course it
Yeah.
helps pull you out of the troughs as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, crypto will do that to you. I've been through I think like 4 cycles now, and it's great when things are going great, but like when we're in a prolonged bear market like we just came out of, it is hard. It's not easy. And there are those moments where like, oh, like, what am I doing here? Should I be in this industry? Should I continue being in this industry? There's been moments where I've wanting to get out and tried to do other things, or dabbled in in other projects. That's fine, but I found that it's always reeled me back in. And I think there's a few things there. One is, obviously it's transformational, and there is a potential for like real change in the world. The other, I think, is just the quality of the people in this space. Like, there's just so many great people, um, who are super smart, who also have this ambition, and who have been through the same sort of humbling experience as you have, and so have a lot of the same sort of qualities that I aspire to. So I think that's what's been sort of keeping me in the space all this time.
Well, and that is the wildest thing about the crypto markets. And, if you've been in venture capital, which I did for 10 years, valuations occur usually every couple of years when a new round's raised. But if you're at the board level or if you're in the company, then you understand that there's a daily roller coaster going on, right? And it's this journey of just peaks and troughs. And if you could price those peaks and troughs in real time, the stock price would be all over the place, probably to
Yeah.
the anxiety of the investors in the fund. And what crypto has done is, my view on it is it's venture capital, right? All these are startups. Even Ethereum is a startup. It's just a late stage startup, but it's with this real time 24-hour market. And a lot of people have a hard time with that. And you really have to have an underlying thesis, which, to your point, the hardest time to be a contrarian by default is when you need to be a contrarian the most. It's when the most people are fearful. It's when people are, dismissive of something that has fundamental value and a good reason to invest in it. But because of price, because of where the world's at, everyone is hesitating to pull the trigger or wants to get out. But of course, that's when the returns are made.
Yeah. Those are the moments where people ask you what you do and you say you're in crypto and you can't really look at them in the eyes. It's like it's it's difficult because that your contrarian view about the world or about the industry that you're in is going to be met with resistance and with dismissal. And like, yeah, those are always the hardest moments. But I think for people, we've been in this space so long, we're just like hardened to the point where we believe in the technology and in the transformative change so much that we're ready to go through those troughs, and like plow through until the next cycle, when everybody's calling you then and asking you, how they should invest or in what they should invest. And those moments are always satisfying. And I try not to get too heady about it, but those are the moments where you're like, oh well, you should have. Remember that time last time when you were telling me that sort of crypto was not the right industry to be in, or downplaying it. That was the time to get in.
Yeah, what's helped me in those moments, and I think this is important in life in general, is when you hear a strong opinion, even if it's from an intelligent person that you respect, the question is, how educated is this opinion? And what's interesting is there's very few extremely educated people about decentralized technology, blockchain, decentralized ledgers that are negative on it, right? It's generally, there's this direct correlation with, I don't like it, I'm not interested in it, I don't get it. But then it's, the follow-up question, of course, would be, well, how much time have you spent trying to understand it?
Yeah.
How many hours per week do you spend researching this technology? Do you go to conferences? Do you talk to people? And the answer is almost always very little. I mean, even Warren Buffett said, I don't like Bitcoin. And then when asked about it, right, his caveat was, but I really haven't looked into it, which to me was always fascinating because that seems like a very un-Warren Buffett thing to do, to have a strong opinion about something that he self-admittedly is not very educated about.
Yeah. I think part of the reason for that is because, um, and I'll use like an anecdote here. In 2020, I helped co-found this organization called ADAN, which is the Association for the Development of Crypto Assets, if I were to translate it here in France. And this organization is now 4 years old, has over 250 members, is probably the largest representative association in Europe, and has done tons of work to help educate policymakers in Brussels, and ultimately has had like huge impact on the MiCA regulation. But when we were setting this up, we were thinking about, okay, what is the mission of this organization, and um, what do we want like Adan's vision and mission to be, and how should we call it? And we were thinking about, okay, we should call this the Blockchain Association, or we should call this, the mission should be to perpetuate blockchain technology. And we were talking with one of the most hardened like Bitcoin maximalists in France, and he ended up not joining the organization. But he said to me, look, if you're going to do this, you need to make it about crypto. It needs to be about crypto, because crypto is really what you're fighting for. You're not fighting for blockchain technology or some like DLT. You're fighting for an ideology, and Bitcoin is inherently political. And from that moment on, we really shifted, and Adan really stood to represent crypto. And I think what I want to come back to here is that crypto is inherently political. It is a political viewpoint to think that money should be open and free and decentralized and permissionless. And so when confronted with like these very dismissive viewpoints about crypto, I think it helps to come back to the fundamentals and to understand why people are so fundamentally like opposed to this. And I think that in most cases it's probably because of a misalignment with ideology.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Speaking of that, I realized you being over in Paris and having a European presence and focus is actually a huge advantage for a conversation point. How do you think crypto is progressing in Europe? And how do you view the progression or lack of progression in the United States from kind of, we're in it. You get to have this different view where you're over in Europe, which we don't really have much insight into. Most people aren't focused there. And then, you get to see America kind of from this zoomed out perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting, because I think I'd like to ask you the same question about the U.S., because I only just sort of get the secondhand information. I think I can start, and then we can sort of compare. I I think that Europe was wise to. Hmm. Let me just okay. Let's maybe start with this. I think the establishment in Europe really doesn't understand, or really fundamentally doesn't understand crypto, and I think that sort of comes back to the point I was making earlier about the politics of crypto, and I think the establishment um, doesn't think that. I think the establishment thinks that crypto goes against the norm, and that the status quo should remain as it is. And I think also in Europe there is this there is a very strong sort of consensus ideology around protectionism, particularly in France. I think this is very much present in the French political ideology generally across most parties. And certainly at the EU level, there's also this very present idea of like protectionism, protect consumers, protect little guys, and this comes through in a lot of the regulation that comes out of EU countries, but also like at the EU level. And I think when you combine something that goes against the norm with this very strong sense of protectionism, you get regulation that attempts to maintain the status quo. And and for the most part, I think that that's what MiCA aims to do. It aims to maintain similar systems and protections in place that exist for traditional financial markets in crypto markets. Now, what is that? What's the outcome? I mean, the outcome from that is a series of controls and systems in place that only favor incumbent actors or actors that have sufficient amount of capital to adhere to those rules, regulations, compliance norms, etc. And so my fear with MiCA is that, and we've already started seeing this a little bit, is that it makes it difficult for new entrants to come into the space and really truly innovate, really create things that are fundamentally new. Will we have a highly regulated market that's highly compliant, super safe to use, protects consumers, etc.? Yeah. Will it be possible for new entrants to come into the space and really innovate and create new things without raising tons of money to be able to cover the compliance costs? I think that will be somewhat limited. I am happy that in its current version, at least, MiCA did not address, or at least it was out of scope, all of the sort of DeFi aspect of crypto, and primarily focuses on centralized actors, but that will come as well. And so at that point, then, I think then we really get to see what kind of innovation, MiCA really allows. And, I think that, at least from my perspective anyway, the US has, American companies have more of a potential to innovate. But I don't know, maybe, I'd love to hear your opinion on it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not an overly political person. It's interesting. I was just reflecting on this. We had a guest that's very focused on this last week, and I would say there's probably a couple big concepts as an American that strike me as we talk about crypto and as we deal with trying to work out regulation. The first is well, I would say overall, I'm a little sad, and the way that I think we're handling it feels very un-American. And what I mean by that is America, you're taught as you're a little kid, was created as a place where you could have freedoms and liberties you didn't have anywhere else in the world. And to choose to invest in crypto, to choose to not be in the traditional monetary system or financial system is just freedom of choice. And so I think you have that going on. And then what we've seen is that companies have started talking crypto, for example, about leaving the US and incorporating in other countries so they can be free to innovate and grow as they need to be innovative, cutting edge technology companies that are competing on a global basis with other companies. And why that's really sad is really, I think, for the last 100 years, what's made America such a superpower is that you hear countless stories of people coming from other countries and building world-class leaders, right, global titans in the corporate landscape, and saying time and time again, I couldn't have done this anywhere else, right? Maybe they came from India and they said, hey, there's a caste system in India. I never would have been able to achieve what I did here as a leader over there. And so you hear these things and you're sad because not only does it feel very un-American and it's almost confusing, but also it's one of our biggest competitive advantages in how we stay ahead is that it's kind of known America's where you go if you want to launch a company and be an entrepreneur, right? The consequences to some degree are your responsibility, but the benefits you get to own. And so as we start to see, kind of a bureaucratic driven slowdown of this innovation machine that also seems to be core to our founding values, which we're taught since we can basically speak, it doesn't feel good. And it feels like it needs to change. Not only needs to change to get better alignment with what we represent present ourselves as a country to the rest of the world, but also for us to stay competitive. I mean, I firmly believe the analogy, Web 1, lots of valuable tech companies were created. Web 2, lots of valuable tech companies. Web 3, the biggest companies of the next 10 years will be Web 3 companies. And don't we want that talent, that, I mean, from a realistic perspective, that taxable income? Don't we want all the benefits of that to stay here in the US, where we've kind of been the leader for Web 1 and Web 2 companies?
Yeah. I mean, what do you think drives this kind of shift in philosophy? And is it, I think like, is it tied to politics, to the political landscape in the U.S. currently?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know a lot of politicians. Politicians basically, I think they vote in favor of what they think is going to be popular. I think also there's some, they bring some values with them. You have people that are very comfortable with the system that was, and they seem to not be encouraging anything that could challenge that system, even though that is how innovation occurs, right? I mean, even when you think about from a very primal example, there's always a stage where like the next generation challenges the previous generation. And it's happened like in countless examples, right? It's like the evolution of rock and roll. Like there's always this perspective from the old guard that the new guard is disrupting the way that things are. But of course, that's how the old guard, they were in those shoes once, right?
Yeah.
So I believe that it's a combination of lack of education, a strong desire to not give up power, because controlling the world's monetary system and kind of having that leverage is a super weapon. And so of course the person with the super weapon doesn't want to give it up. But I think it's very obvious that this trajectory we're on, which is a very debt focused system that is becoming more, there's more and more laws, right? But less laws are getting removed, right? I think it's like, I don't know what the stat is, but it's like an insane amount of laws get created to laws getting removed. And
Yeah.
so I think it's just a combination of all these things. It's a lot of fear. What does this mean for us if we move to a new monetary system? And then, of course, like, the scams, the bad actors. Look, this happens in every industry, right? There was an Enron, just like there was an FTX. In fact, they almost ran the same playbook. But of course, that gains momentum in the mainstream media, that politicians generally rally around that. And so, at the end of the day, though, I think decentralized technology and the freedoms that it brings to own your assets, own your identity, own your data, once again, are some of the most American principles that exist. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg's constantly in front of some political party, right? Trying to answer, what do you do with our data? What do you know about us that we don't know? And Web3 solves a lot of these problems potentially. So you would think at some point, once the education, we'll call it chasm, gets kind of filled and people realize that hopefully there will be this 180-degree turning where we'll embrace the innovation and try to accommodate it versus fighting it.
Do you think maybe that this has to do, as you were speaking, I was thinking, like, what is it about, crypto that, the establishment is so against, or what makes it such that, currently in this current era, the financial establishment has so much power over regulating crypto in the US. And if you think about it, the internet and the web really revolutionized publishing. Now, publishing, I think that the American media landscape, right? Like really powerful American media started I guess in the 50s, right? Like 30s or 40s maybe, with the mainstream adoption of television. and but the financial sector in the state in the US is older, right? The financial sector sort of stems from the late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it's had a longer time to build up its power as an establishment. And so essentially now that all of these sort of like major industries have been fundamentally transformed by the web, now we're getting to sort of like the final the final domino, which is like the financial sector, which is the strongest and sort of like oldest industry in the US. And this is like the final boss, right? And then like the final boss is super strong. And so like perhaps the time and the time that the financial sector has had to gain all this power and concentrate all this power and build those political relationships and get ingrained with politics, that wasn't the case for, say, the media, or like other industries like cinema, or other industries that like the music industry that the web have disrupted. Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense or is relevant, but just like a thought I had now.
No, I mean, I think you asked a good point. Look, it's as an investor, right? To be a good investor, you always have to consider the opposite opinion before truly committing to your own. You always have to test that. And look, as a financial system right now, where crypto is, it wouldn't be a very good financial system, right? It's way too volatile, right? When you think about if you're a government and you're trying to decide on a financial system, there's certain things you want, and high volatility is not one of them. In fact, this is like what people don't appreciate in America and usually first world countries about crypto is like, we don't have this problem where we wonder every day or every week if the amount of money we have in the bank is going to be worth half as much. And that sounds like a fairy tale, but that happens all the time in second and third world countries, right? There's countless examples of it going on now where inflation hits and, there's all these pictures of somebody counting out a pile of cash, right, on their desktop. And this is essentially to pay for a loaf of bread. And so we don't have this problem, but we could have this problem. And so I think where the friction goes against crypto is the volatile nature of it, the misunderstanding of what's driving that volatility, and the lack of understanding of how do we get to a system that has less volatility, because I don't think that's good for your average person, right? It's like you're almost in the same problem where, you could tell somebody in an inflationary, with a fear of inflation, to put your money in Bitcoin, but that person's not going to feel any better if Bitcoin drops by 50% over the next year. So I do think there's probably warrants there. But once again, the desire should be, as a species, as a country, we should all be seeking to progress. And progression is going to have its hiccups, but let's figure out a way to bring about change, because change is the way that all countries and the species in general gets better. And what I'm not seeing is certain parties taking those steps or bringing that spirit to this new technology and new financial system. I'm not seeing that as much. In fact, I'm seeing, when I go back to the basics, it's like, we don't want you to have an alternative. We want you to stay with ours. And that is, once again, very un-American, right? Like America is supposed to be the opposite of that. In fact, we'll break up monopolies if we see that taking place. So why should we encourage a monopoly essentially in this domain? It just feels strange to me is the best way that I can articulate it.
Yeah, I mean, from a French perspective, and certainly from the perspective, I think a lot of EU countries, that view of the world is very foreign to people. And like, I grew up in Canada, so I have some proximity to the US and like American values, and like and I think like Canada for a long time had sort of similar values, although that is also starting to shift. Although I don't live in Canada and haven't for over 15 years, so I don't have like firsthand account there. But when sort of superimposing that onto a lot of the political rhetoric and just people's opinions here in France, it's like that that idea of like being free to, do whatever you like, right? I mean, like there's a very sort of simple and very primitive example that I like to use sometimes. I think in most common law countries where you have a common law legal system, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you just like snap your fingers and like, okay, I am an entrepreneur. I am a business. Like I am a sole proprietor business. Um, I'm going to sell services and products, and you have like lots of companies that start like this. And in fact, I think most small businesses in the U.S. are probably just sole proprietor businesses. They don't have any like corporation or anything like that. Now that comes with risks, right? It comes with the risk of having your personal assets and sort of business assets being intermingled, but that's your business. In France, that's not possible. And I think a lot of EU countries, that's not possible also. I know for a fact that like in Germany and Portugal, if you want to be a freelancer or any sort of sole proprietor business, you have to ask for permission. I mean, you have to, it's not like you wouldn't be like a limited liability corporation, but you still need a registration number. You still need to be registered with the state. Still need to report to the state on your income and like pay all sorts of social security charges, etc. But you can't just like wake up one day and start invoicing people. And so I've always found that to be like, deeply offensive. That the most fundamental thing is that that you can be the owner of your own sort of destiny, and to build something for yourself, you need permission to do that. And so that's just the sort of start of it. And if you look at France broadly, there's something like 500,000 norms in France, and so that's everything from how you build things, how you invoice for things, how sort of the agriculture sector has to run itself, etc. And so for a lot of small businesses and artisans and people who work the fields and people who raise cattle, etc., there's so many norms that they have to that they have to deal with and they have to reason with, that they spend most of their time figuring out the administrative hurdles that they have to go through to just like run their businesses. And I mean, this is one of the reasons why you may have heard this, like there's been an uproar of the agriculture sector in France and in Germany and in Belgium. It is the overhead that the state has put on all these just hardworking people to just do their job that is becoming so difficult and so hard to handle and so hard to deal with on a daily basis and costly that the gasket blew off.
Yeah.
And so I'm definitely for, at least here where I live, a simplification of all of the norms and laws that govern just everyday citizens that are getting just overburdensome for just like regular people.
Yeah, it was interesting when you were talking. I was thinking and reflecting on what you were saying, and I was thinking, it's kind of like it's a cultural thing, right? So, we've all been a part of startups and different companies. It's sort of like if you worked for, we can use any analogy, but let's say a car or watch manufacturer. And ever since you worked at the company, all they would talk about at the town hall meetings, all the corporate educational documents, what they would say in their advertising is, we use the highest quality products to make our watches, right? So we are on craftsmanship. We don't aim to be the cheapest. We don't cut corners. And then suddenly there starts to be these conversations of, hey, we're going to start reducing the quality parts that we use in our watches. And that's sort of what I feel like it feels like to be in crypto in America right now, where you're sort of you're like, wait a minute, like this feels weird. Like, why are we doing that? We've never done, and it's kind of against our ethos. It's against the culture that we exist in. And so, the people that are more and more privy to that information, or the more people that are educated about crypto, are scratching their heads and saying, I don't understand what management is doing. Not in the sense of the decision, so if somebody said, for example, that a French company or a different company said, oh, well, that company over there is cutting costs in the materials they use, it wouldn't mean anything or as much to me. But because I'm in this company, that's all they've talked about, is that basically we'll never do this. Or it's, they've talked about principles that would make someone think they would never do it. Then it starts to feel really weird. And I think that's the best analogy I can give.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense to me, and yeah, I think that from a European perspective, look, if you go on that analogy, certainly what I'm seeing here, in France, and it's not about the quality, it's about um, how much it's about how much perceived burden can the state lift off of its citizens. But with that comes less freedoms just generally.
Mm-hmm.
And someone once, like this French kind of thinker, philosopher, um, slash politician, once said that the ambition for the French state, the French establishment is to be the great protector, like protect everyone in every single instance, um, in every single thing that could happen to you, or in every single situation. Like there is a law that's going to protect you, but that just removes agency. And I think most people don't think about it, but that's something I think about a lot. Is what agency do I have to build a business, to protect myself, to like the agency that one has, I think, is not very valued. And that, I think, at the end of the day, it is not like create a very robust society. And I say this after having spent 17 years here. I think it's something that's really I've started thinking about a lot, and really seeing and considering over the last 5 or 6 years. As I've kind of grown older and realized, okay, like buying a house and starting a business, and like trying to build something, and sort of seeing my colleagues and peers in other parts of the world, and like certainly in the US, like there's such a chasm, in terms of what people's ideologies are, in terms of like their own, having like their lots of agency over what they can do in their life. And so that's caused me to rethink where I want to live, and how I want to live the next decades of my life.
Yeah. Well, it's super fascinating. I think we could spend another hour talking. Our time's coming to an end. How can people find more out about the podcast, about the fund? Where do they go? Give us a little direction there.
Sure. So Epicenter is epicenter.tv. We're on all the podcast platforms and on YouTube. I also host another podcast called The Interop, which is a little bit more thesis focused with the fund. So like Epicenter is a pretty broad crypto podcast. We cover everything from Bitcoin to Ethereum to like all of the new L2s and other things, right? We've had like lots of great guests on Epicenter, but the Interop is a little bit more thesis focused. So you'll see a lot more podcast episodes about the Cosmos ecosystem, the modular stack, interoperability, and sort of the things that we look at with the fund. The fund's Interop Ventures. It's interop.ventures. And yeah, we also host Nebula Summit, which is our developer conference. It happens every summer right around ECC. And this year we'll be in Brussels because Paris is hosting the Olympics. And so everybody's moving to Brussels for the summer. But yeah, people who are interested in Cosmos and just like crypto infrastructure in general should check that out.
Love it. Thanks for your time. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon, Sebastien.